Hi everyone, welcome to another episode, and in this video we will start to work on the login and register functionality to our application. But before we do that, we need to establish something called a user session. So we'll implement a standard session mechanism that is based on cookies, and cookies are just pieces of information that are stored in your browser that your browser attaches to a request that it does, right? So for example, when I click around here, right, what is happening in the background, and we already know this because we have implemented endpoints that actually respond to these requests. Our browser is just making requests to an API behind the scenes. And what's currently happening with these requests is that the application doesn't know what user is making these requests. So if I just come here and click around, right, the application doesn't really know that that the same person is making the same requests. It could be just me, or there could be my friend who's also like adding, removing, and setting these to-dos to done. We currently don't know it. So before we start to implement any kind of like logging or register mechanism, we need to establish something called a session. And a session will be used by the application to figure out that, okay, the person who made the request is actually the same person or the same open application, so the same client, so to speak. And this is what we'll work on in this video. Now, there is a very popular package called Passport in which you can implement that very, very easy. However, we will not do that. So we will not use Passport for the login and register, and we'll not use Passport for the session management. We will just implement that from scratch. And of course, it will take longer. It will be more complex. However, I think that for this episode, as this is like a strictly a series where we learn the basics, I think it's crucial that you understand how these things work and that you are able to then properly judge what you should use for your next applications, because of course there are other methods you can use to authorize and authenticate in your application. Okay, so we're here in our application, and now what we need to do is we need to go to our app folder and we need to create a new file. Let's call that file maybe session.js. Okay, and in that file, we need to create some functions. So what we need is we need a way to create the session, in other words, to add the session to the database. We need a way of getting the session from the database, and then we need a middleware function that will check if a request has a session ID and if the session ID is valid, and then we'll either do nothing or we'll issue a new session ID. Okay, so first off, what we need to do is we need to create a function. Function will be asynchronous because we'll definitely access the database here. And this function will take a session ID, and then we will take a valid2. So a valid2 we will use because our session cookie, so our cookie with session ID, will be valid only for a time period that we'll specify. Okay, so in this function, we'll access the database. So let's say, and let's maybe, before we do that, let's initialize the response here, and let's await, and we want to query. And how convenient, it has imported a client for us. So here you can see that Visual Studio Code automatically, if you use it here, it will add an import here. So that's very nice. Let's do the following. And now what we need to do is we need to insert into, and now we need to call the database somehow, the database table somehow that we have not yet created. Let's call it maybe sessions. It will have an ID and then valid2. And what we want to insert is values, $1 and then $2. Okay, and here we pass an array and we pass in here the session ID and then the valid2. Okay, so here it will take session ID valid 2. Okay, that's cool. And now what we need to do is we also need to add a catch block. For now, in the catch block, we'll just display the error to console, and then no matter what, we will return the response. Okay, that's our first function, and so this function actually needs us to be able to insert something in the sessions table, and the sessions table currently doesn't really exist. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to create this table. In order to do that, let's create a new SQL file here. Let's call it sessions.sql, and let's start with the drop table if exist sessions, and then let's do a create table sessions, and the table sessions will have the following columns. It will have an ID that will be a varchar, and it will be a primary key of our table. It will have this valid to column, which will define when or to what timestamp our session key is valid, and this is not null. And then what I like to add is, of course, this added DTTM. That's also not null. Oops, not null, and that has a default of now, so that we don't have to care about it. Okay, and here I made a typo with sessions. Okay, that's cool. Let's continue. So we go back to our session file, and we have the first session. So what we now need to do is we need to create a function that will get us this session. So let's create an asynchronous function, get session, that takes the session ID as a parameter. And let's do the following. Let's define here macro, that's session, and then let's do a try, and we'll try to select await client.query. Okay, and in the client.query, we will try to do the following. We'll try to select ID and valid to from sessions, where now our ID equals $1, and that's kind of crucial. Let's maybe put that to separate lines. So where ID equals $1, and valid to is higher or equal to now. So basically, we will only select the session if there exists a valid session. We could also select it always and then compare the timestamps in JavaScript, but comparing timestamps in JavaScript is kind of tricky sometimes. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is we want to minimize the traffic between the database and the backend application. Of course, in our case, that's not that much overhead as these are on the same server, but it's just good practice that we want to follow. Let's maybe change the formatting here slightly. Okay, and so let's do it here. Let's do here. We could even just to make the formatting appear same. And here we of course want to put in our session ID. Okay, and then we want to have, of course, a catch block. And in the catch block, we for now want to just console error, this error. And then what we want to do here is we want to return undefined. So in case we have an error, we will return undefined. Okay, and then if this session and then the row count, because if you remember, this does not only return us the ID and the valid to, this returns us this whole response object. So what we want to have here is if session.row count is equal to 1, we want to return session.rows. In other case, we want to return undefined. So basically here it's a guard clause. If our session, or basically if our query has returned only one row, we'll return the first row. and otherwise we will return undefined. Okay, so this is our get session function. And currently let's move on to a function that will actually issue our session ID, because now what we need to do is we need to create a function that will be a middleware function. But before we do that, we will just create a helper function for us so that basically it can handle everything that needs to be done for our session ID or for our cookie to be issued. So here what we need to do, we need to create an asynchronous function. Let's call it issue maybe session ID. This will take no parameters. And first thing first, we need to create a session ID, and the session ID will be something that we have used before. It will be our UUID v4, and this means that we of course need to import it right here, UUID v4, and we want to require it from UUID package. Okay, so here we have initialized our session ID. Now let's move on. What we now want is we want to get current time, and we need to get current time to increment it by the time that we want our cookie to be valid. So the way we do that is we say current time and then set seconds, and here we do once again current time dot get seconds. That's a function, and we increment it by process.env, and now we need to create an environment variable for it. And the environment variable, once again, you need to add to your environment variables on your system. And what we need to, so let's maybe call this environment variable cookie age in seconds, because this will be in seconds. Yeah, and that's it. And so just so that we don't forget, let's go to our Docker Compose file. Let's find our app, and let's add this environment variable right here. And did we make a mistake? It should be, or did I make a mistake? This should be double O. Okay, that's good. And you also need to add this to your environment variables. Or there is an alternative that we can use, and I actually think it makes sense that we use it, because then it will be a little bit easier to test it. What we can use is something called .env. And here you just say require.env, and then you say config, and here you specify a path. And now the path is a path to a .env file that we'll create. Therefore, let's maybe think about it. Where do we create it? Let's maybe create it here. Let's say .env, and now we have a .env file. And here we can say, for example, that we want to specify an environment variable. And because here in the session.js file we specified this .env, it will actually, on start, when it reads this line, it will go look for the .env file, and it will read this as an environment variable. So this is kind of a way we could also start and initiate environment variables. You can also do that. So basically we could move the environment variables that we have right here to this .env file, with some exceptions. So basically, if you need a macro variable to be there when the container starts, so for example, for these Postgres, here in the Postgres image, we could not really do that. However, here for the app, we might as well do it. Maybe we'll do that in the future. But for now, let's keep it like it is. Then only we'll need to remember to also create this file when we move to production. But here we have it. Here we might as well, if this doesn't really exist, we might add some default. So basically, let's maybe go ahead here and do a const cookie age, and then we will do either this value, or we'll do, say, I don't know, 600, right? This is 10 minutes. This should be fine. And now the cookie age actually defines how often a new session will be generated. It actually for now doesn't really do anything. It will, just as I said in the introduction, it will allow you to track, okay, this request or so this action on your web application was made by the same user. And then we could, of course, work with that in the future. Okay, but we have done this. Let's now continue. What we want to do is we want to await our function that we have created on top, and it takes our session ID and it takes our current time. So our current time is no longer our current time because we have added some seconds to it. However, the variable is still called like this. As it's an asynchronous part of code, let's maybe wrap it in a try and catch. Let's for now just display the error. And what we want to do is we want to use this. And this is maybe a little bit tricky to understand, but what will happen is now this function in the middleware function later on will be called on the response object. So we will call on the response object, we'll call this function so that it will call a cookie function that is on the response object. And the cookie function that is on the response object will generate a cookie for us. So let's say this.cookie. I think it will be slightly easier to understand once we create the further function. So first it takes the cookie key. Let's say it's session ID. Then it takes the value. It's our case, it's session ID. And then it takes an object where we can insert some parameters. So basically we can say max age, and the max age is 1000 times cookie age. We want this cookie to be HTTP only, so that it's only attached to the HTTP request, and we want it signed to be true. Signed to be true in a cookie just generates a hash of the contents of the cookie. It's not really a game changer in our case. We are not sending any important information here, but I feel like this just adds a layer of security here. Okay, and that's everything that we want this function to do. So currently we have a function that we'll use in a second with our main session function. Now this main session function will actually return us a middleware, and as it's a middleware, it needs to take a request, response, and next. So this is basically a middleware function in NodeJs. Is a function that is executed on the stack, and the stack is basically functions that are executed every time that there is a request received by one of the endpoints, right? And you might have middleware functions that are executed every time, or you might have middleware functions that are executed only with a specific endpoint. But what we want to do is we want to ensure that on the request object we have a session object. So on the request object we have a session key. That's an object. For now, let's keep it empty. The reason is that we initiate it. For one of the reasons is some implementations of login and register functionalities, for example, the one in Passport, depends on a request having this. So we set it so that we know that, okay, we will always have it. Later on, let's say that our session, let's basically try to get our session, right? So what we need to do is we want to await, and then we want to use our get session function, and then we want to get the cookie value from the request object. So here we will try to get the cookie value from a request, right? So this will return something if this user already has a valid valid session ID, so a valid session ID cookie. It will not return anything if the user does not have anything or if it's not valid anymore. So you do it by request and then signed cookies, and it's signed because we signed it, session ID, and this is the cookie key. Okay, and then we have done this. And now we'll write an if statement, basically if session equals undefined, equals undefined, or our signed cookies, request.signed cookies by session ID equals undefined. So basically if this returns, this does not return anything, or if our signed cookies, so basically if this session returns anything, so if the session does not exist in our database, or if it's no longer valid anymore, or if it's the first request that user makes against our application, and this is covered by this part of the if statement, what we want to do is we want to issue such session ID. So we want to do issue session ID, and now we want to call it. So basically what we do using this call method is we will call this function, this issue session ID function, on the response object, and therefore using this method, this response object becomes this issue session ID function. So the concept of this is a little bit convoluted. I highly encourage to read a little bit more, because here it's depending on how you use it, it can behave different. However, this should allow us to safely issue this session ID, and as it is a part of asynchronous code, let's quickly wrap it in our try catch blocks. Let's, for now, as we usually do, let's console with this error. Later on, we'll be working on actually displaying some errors to the user. We will definitely add some pieces here, but for now, we just console this error, and then we want to return, no matter what, we want to return next. So basically, by saying return next, you return the next middleware in the stack, right? So assuming that we have this middleware executed before, for example, the main function for an endpoint, this will generate, or this will move on just to the next function, which may be something that handles a login, or which may be something that which may be the main function for the endpoint. Okay, so now we have this if statement here. So here we handled cases that either session is not valid or it doesn't exist. And now we want to handle, I would say, standards. And a standard is that we assign this session object, and that we assign this to the session object, we assign the session. Here it would make sense. So for example, for now it does not really bring us any value, but later on when we move to something like when we'll be using the session parameters, for example, if you wanted to implement something like remember me, right? So that when a user logs in, then they don't have to log in for the next, I don't know, some days, we'll be utilizing this. And then we want to return next. Okay. That's it. So currently, that's it for our session functions. And let's just, for the sake of not forgetting, let's say that our module will export the create session function, create session. It will export get session. It will export issue session ID. And it will export our session. Okay, let's save it. And now we need to do one more thing. We need to move to our app file, and we need to add this to our middleware stack. It's super simple to do. We just need to write a const here, session, and we need to require it from the current folder .session. Okay, if you mouse over, I can see that it's a function. So everything was fine. And we need one more thing. We need something called a cookie parser. So it allows us to, or it creates a nice require. So it creates just a nice cookie object out of the headers of a request. It just allows you to work with cookies much easier. Actually, it's needed for example, here we used the request.signed cookies. It's actually needed for the object to exist, or for the key on the request object to exist. Let's go back to our app folder here. Okay, so it's a cookie parser, and it's from cookie.parser. This of course means that we need to let's go into our app folder. We need to install it. npmi cookie parser. Okay, that's fine. And currently, let's also use it. So here we can just do app.use and not unsubscribe, use. And here you have to say cookie, oops, not like this, cookie parser. And here we need to do one more thing. What we need to do is we need to set a secret. So the cookie parser requires us to set a secret. And the secret here is actually optional. It's used for the signed cookies. So it's used to generate the hash of the contents. Let's actually provide something like this. And we can do that very easily if we just say node, and then we say require, and we require a crypto package. Oops, crypto. Okay, and we say random bytes. Let's say 32, and let's say to string x. Okay, and we get a nice random piece of 64 characters. Let's add it to our, let's say secret equals, and then this. Okay, let's go to our app. Let's use it right here. Of course, we need to say process env.secret. Okay, and the only thing we need to do is we need to also load the .env here. Okay, that's cool. And that's our cookie parser set up. We need to do one more thing, which means we need to create our sessions table. So let's do that. Let's exit out of here once again. And let's say currently we are, okay, let's move out of this folder and let's say psql-u postgres-f and then scripts/sessions.sql. Okay, our table has been created. That's good. I already was testing something, so I already had this table. If you didn't, you would just get a notice that the table didn't exist, so it was not dropped. But currently it was also created, so that's good. Okay, we should be able to, or we should be ready to run our application now. So in order to do that, let's go into our app folder. Let's clear the screen. And let's say npm run start. Okay, so it cannot find module.env, which makes sense because we need to install it. And once again, let's run the application. Okay, it looks like our application is running. Let's check how it looks like. So here I have our application on the right-hand side. It's on localhost. Let's try to maybe add some things, click around. It seems to be working, but let's check if we get our cookie. So to do that, we need to go to inspect, and we find here application, and we can check what we here have. I will for now delete this one. Let me refresh. and we are not getting anything. This means that something went wrong and our application is not really creating any sessions for us. Okay, so let's check out what went wrong. And what might have gone wrong is even the Visual Studio Code here actually gives us a hint, and because session is declared but is never used. This is not good. We should use it. So we should say app.use and session. Okay, let's save it. Let's here, once again, let's run our application, maybe this time using NodeMon. App.js. Okay, and the app has crashed. And it's because we are in a wrong folder. So let's go once again inside our application, and here we are on our application. Okay, good. Now let's refresh. And we get an error, and we see that our secret is required for signed cookies. Okay, so it means that this here is not really working as it should. Okay, let's check it out. And the reason is that the path that we have here doesn't really matter. What matters is how do we start our application. So now, if we go in here and we do, and here I think I have added, if you go back to the app application, I have added a console.log of our secret. So if you take a look right here, right, if we start just app, if we go into the app folder and say just NodeMon app.js, we are getting an undefined. But if I now go back and I do app/app.js, all of a sudden the secret works. Okay, so that's an important learning for us. However, currently our secret works. Okay, let's remove the debugging console log. And let's go to our application, let's refresh. And what we can see here, it's our session ID. And we can see that it's been generated. It looks like a random string of characters. Okay, so I would like to change one more thing. For now, we have cookie age in seconds 5. So let's here take a look at the QGY. Let's refresh. And it seems, yes, we have the same. Let's quickly refresh once again. Okay, we got the same. Let's wait a few seconds. And here we have different one. Okay, this looks like it works perfect. We made it work. However, it only seems like it works. And to make sure that it works and to make sure that it will work in the future, we need to go into our test folder and we need to write some tests for it. But before we do that, let's go into our package.json folder and let's write here, create a dev start script. And the dev start script will be NodeMon app/app.js, so that we don't have to remember it and we can just go into the root of our project and we can just say npm run dev start. Okay, let's now get to creating the tests. First, to create the tests, we need to create a new test file. So here in the test folder, let's create a new file called session.js because it's going to test the, no, let's move it one folder up, because it's going to test this session file. Okay, and now what I like to do is I like to place this file over here so that here I will have the file that I want to test, and here I will have currently empty test file. Okay, so first off, what we need is we need to import the functions that we want to test. For now, let's focus on the create session and the get session. Here the issue session ID and the session will get to as a second priority. Okay, create session. Not that they are less important, actually they are more important in my opinion, but they're slightly more complex to test them. Okay, but here we want to require them and we need to go one folder app and then go into the app and then into session. Okay, these, as you can see, these were recognized as functions. This means that this import works. Thank you, Visual Studio Code. Okay, then what we want to have is we want to have a describe section. Here, let's just call, this will be like a wrapper for all of our test cases. Let's just maybe say testing session. And let's create a function here. Okay. So after we do so, let's create another describe section, and here we'll be testing creating the session. And once again, we put a function here. And what we want to do is, before we start testing, we want to make sure that we have a clean testing setup. Therefore, whoops, not this. We use the before hook. Ugh, come on. Before, escape, and now it works. And inside the before hook, let's make use of the asynchronous function, because we will want to now we will want to query the database. What we want to do is we want to delete from sessions where ID equals $1. And now what we need to do is we need to, oops, not like this, like this. So now what we need to do is we need to create some kind of testing session ID. So let's do that. Let's here go ahead and let's say testing session. Once again, this will be a global variable, so I put it in all caps. And let's let. So our testing session will be, we'll have a session ID of, let's say, test session ID, and we'll have a valid 2. And now the valid 2 we need to figure out earlier. So first off, we need to create here a variable that will store how long our session will be valid. This, for the purpose of testing these two functions, does not have to be valid as long as it is in our real application. So here we can just set it to 1 second, for example. And what we need to do now is we need to create the date. So let's say testing valid 2, and let's set it equal to a new date, and then testing valid 2, the same way we did it last time, set seconds, testing valid 2.get seconds, that's a method, and plus testing valid 2 seconds. Okay, that's good. Let's maybe move it to a new line so that everything here is visible. Perfect. And now we'll be able to take this date and use it here. And our testing session should be created. And that's maybe const. Because this will not change. Okay. So what we can do now here is we can use our testing session ID. And this before hook will ensure that we always start with a clean setup, so that we'll just, the one run of test cases will not influence the second run of our test cases. Once again, ID, escape. And now what we want to check is so we are in the create session, and we want to check for the correct return information. So as you remember, when we create the session and we capture the response object should have a key, which is a row count, which is equal to how many rows were changed, and here exactly 1 row was changed. If there was an error here, this row count would not be equal to 1. Okay, so once again, we will be querying the database, so asynchronous, and the function, and response will be equal, we want to await so that the promise is resolved. And here we'll just create a session. Let's once again move it to a different line so that it is testing session dot valid 2. Okay, let's wrap it up here, and now we want to expect, and here I think exactly. Visual Studio Code also imported the expect from Chai. That's good. Thank you, Visual Studio Code. We want to expect our response object row count to equal 1. And I really like this syntax here. So really, once you sort of get familiar with it, it's like speaking English. Basically, you expect something to be equal to something, and that's super cool. Okay, that's it. That seems good. Let's maybe check if it works, because it should currently. Let's maybe terminate our application, or let's say npm run test. Okay, we have some errors. Relation session, yeah, because we called it sessions. That's correct. Thank you, test. And 7 test passing. Let's run them once again. Passing once again. That's good. Let's move on to next testing section, which will be we want to now check, or we want to get this session, and we want to check if this session is equal to our testing session. So once again, let's go describe. Let's get the session. So let's maybe add create a session and get this session. And here we want to pass in a function once again. And here we want to test if the fetched session is equal to testing session. And here once again we want to pass in an asynchronous function. So we do it. Let's maybe make this a little bit smaller, and so that we see a little bit more here. Okay, what we want to do is we want to have a response with that, and now we want to await. We want to use the get session function, and here we pass in the testing session dot session ID. That's cool. And then we want to expect, and now we go to our get session. So the get session will return us an object that will have here it will return us the session.rows, the first row. So we want first off, we want to expect the response.id to equal testing session dot session ID. So we want the response ID to be equal to our testing ID. And once again, let's copy this and let's go in here, and we want this valid _2, and it's with an underscore because this is how the column is called, be equal to valid 2. Okay, that's cool. Let's maybe test if our test works. Something doesn't work. That's not good. And yeah, I forgot it. So basically, currently this is why I said that sometimes comparing timestamps in JavaScript is a little bit tricky, because if you take a look here, these look exactly the same. However, they are not, because they are a different instance of a date object. So here what you need to do is you need to add deep. So once again, y and npm run test, and the test is passing. Let's run the test second time, and the test is passing. Okay, yeah, that's cool. So, but maybe let's, as you remember, we have this mechanism that we should not get the session if our session is not valid. So basically, if the more than the time we specified here, or in our application, this will be our end variable, has passed, we should not get this session anymore. Okay, so let's maybe create a test case which will check if this works. So let's get session. Let's call it get session that is not valid anymore. And this session that we create right here is valid only for 1 second. So our tests usually take like 1.174 milliseconds. Therefore, it's a lot less than 1 second. Therefore, this is fine that it works. But here, let's create a test case. That will not work so good. What we want to do is, before, we want to have an asynchronous function. Inside this asynchronous function, I will create a function which will be called sleep. It will take a millisecond argument, and it will return us, return a new promise. So now the promise will take a response, And what will happen is we will set a timeout. So basically, what this function will do is it will wait for the specified number of milliseconds. So basically, it will sleep, and then it would execute a response. Or rather, we needed to pass a response here because this is how the promise function is created, or rather how the set timeout function is created. Okay, so that's it for our sleep function. That's good. Let's currently here await it. So we await the sleep, and then we want to sleep, let's say, for 1.5 seconds. You have to watch out with setting the time longer than 2 seconds, because a Mocha has a timeout on 2 seconds, and it will throw you an error if this lasts more than 2 seconds. Usually, if your tests of a web application take more than 2 seconds, something is not all right. So after waiting for 1.5 seconds, we should be, which is longer than 1 second, we should, so our get session should return undefined. So let's test for this. Async, we'll have a resp, that will be get session. And here, once again, we pass in the testing session.session ID. And here we expect the response, to be equal to undefined. Okay. So currently it's a little bit more logic. Let's check if it works. Good. And yeah, and you precisely saw, let's try it once again. You precisely saw that it started the wait now and finished it. So our tests no longer sadly take 170 milliseconds, but now take 2 seconds, but that's all right. That is all right, and you can see that our mechanism is working fine. It seems that we returned undefined, and this is also consistent with what we saw in our application, that basically we are, after like the time that we specified passed, we were getting a new session ID, so a new session ID cookie. That's good. Okay, let's maybe create one more test case, because this function also should return as undefined if a session just does not exist. So let's say get not existing session. Let's pass in here and it should return undefined. So this will be an asynchronous, because we need to await something inside it, and then we want the response to be equal to not client, but we want await get session. And here we want to pass in the session ID, and we want to expect the response. Once again, to equal undefined. Oops, if I could spell undefined. That's cool. Okay, let's test this. Once again, the wait, 10 passing. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so this also works. So now, what we need to do is we need to test the two functions that we have down here. So we need to test the issue session ID and then session. And currently, it's my first thought would be that we should or can test these two functions separately, and this is usually one of the this usually shows, if you can do that, right? If you just can take your functions and test them very easily, that the design of your code is pretty good, because this means that you have a clear logic encapsulated into a single function. And I don't currently remember where I read it or heard it, is that basically if your code is easy to test and you don't have to do a lot of setup and some weird things, this means that it's good. That means that the design of your code is good. And to be honest, I very often think about it when I write code. I think about it, okay, how I would test the code, or maybe I even write the test earlier. But I have this in mind, right? That, okay, if I'm thinking how to split a certain logic, more complex piece of logic into functions, I think, okay, what would be the easiest to test? And I think, for example, like an example of that is, right, how the create session function is defined. So the create session function takes a session ID as a parameter, but we could as well generate it here, right, and not take it as a parameter, and then somehow return it, right, in the response. I think it already does return it somewhere in the response object. Then it would not be so easy to test, right? Because in order to test, for example, later on, if the session is equal to our testing session, we would need to look up it, I don't know, using the valid to or using the maximum date where it was added, and this would be significantly harder than it is currently. Therefore, it's nice that it takes the session ID as parameter, because we can just conveniently pass in the session ID, and that works very well. So at least that helps me when I think about how do I structure the code, right? I think about, okay, how will I test the code? And usually the easier the test, the better the design. And currently here in this function, there's one tricky thing. There's this.cookie, and this is something we call coupling. And basically this means that this implementation of our issue session ID function is dependent on the implementation of this cookie function, and basically on this object, which will here become the response object. So this just means that these are coupled, and you want to avoid that as much as possible. I currently did not see any better way of, to be honest, of doing this. At least not a straightforward way. Therefore, instead of testing both of these functions separate, we will just test them together. So we will just test if the logic of receiving a new cookie ID, or if the logic of receiving a cookie actually works. Okay, in order to do that, we need to add some dependencies to our tests. First off, we need chai. Chai, we know, we have already used it to test the to-dos. Then we need chai HTTP. Chai HTTP. Then we need our app. Oops, I think I messed something up. We need to require our app. So we need to go app into app, and then file is called app. Did it go? Okay, it works. You can see that it is this is an express class. That's good. And I think that's it for our imports. And then we need to say chai use chai HTTP. Okay, and now we move to our tests. Let's create a next session or next section. Sorry. Let's say testing session middleware. And here in the testing session middleware, let's say that we want to check if the session is assigned. Okay, and now we will be making a request. So let's use the done argument here, and let's say chai.request app. And then, by the way, here if you don't know what this is, you should go back to one of the previous episodes where we were writing the test. I currently don't remember the number of the episodes, but where we created all the tests for our to-dos. There I sort of went into more detail how do you use chai here. And here we need to make some kind of request. This really doesn't matter what kind of request we make here. I'll just go to our main page. Okay, and here we get an error and we get a response. Wait, something is not, okay, that's good. Something is not very good here. We should have another parenthesis here. Okay, and now we want to expect the response.headers. So basically headers is just a key of the response object, and it has a set cookie key. And out of the set cookie key, we want to grab the first, I think the only item that is there. And we want to check if it includes, let's maybe move it to a new line. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Includes, and we want to check if it includes a string session ID equals, because this is the key of our, maybe without the equals, this is the key of our cookie. And good, and we want the expectation. Where is the parentheses here? We want to equal, and we want it to be equal true. So includes function just returns true if it finds this string inside this string. Okay, and that's good. Let's terminate and let's run it once again. And we get an error. Why? Require is not defined. No, I never can spell require properly. Let's once again run the tests. And looks like everything is fine, except that we get, except that we did not get here we need to say done. And this is exactly the same issue that we had, right? That initially you get a correct result and then it fails because too much time has passed. Okay, that's cool. It looks like it's working. So we started with writing one test case for the session middleware. However, we have also a different functionality there, which says basically that if the session is expired, it should return us with a new different session ID. Therefore, let's also test for this. So what we'll need to do now is we'll need to create a similar similar describe block for a different session ID. And what we will need to do here is we will need to actually get this, we'll actually need to get the session ID here, and this problem is that it is not parsed yet, but I think we can manage. Let's go in here. Let's do let's take a short look how it looks like. Let's shortly print it to our console. Okay, that's fine. We see it here. So the session ID, and then you can see some other parameters of the cookie. The session ID has the following contents. So this is our ID, and then this is the hash of the cookie content. However, so let's take this part. So every time the content is the same, the hash will also be the same. So it starts with an equal sign and it ends with a semicolon. Okay. Therefore, what I want to do is I want to create a variable which will be called the start index, because currently I will extract this part of information to a variable, and then we will later on check if after we once again wait some time, the different session ID that we get when we make a second request will be different than the one that we have currently. Okay, so this will be once again this part, and then what we want to do here is we want to search for an equal sign. And because it's zero based, or rather how the function that we'll use later on to slice the index, which will be literally called slice, works, we will subtract 1 here, and this will be the same thing. However, here we will search for a semicolon. Okay, and now we need to create this here. First, let's call it first session ID. So it's sufficient if we just initialize it here. Let's remove this console log, and let's do first session ID is equal to, once again, this, and then slice, or maybe it will be a little bit more if we did a little bit better if we did a const cookie here and assign it here, and now instead of using this piece of information so many times, we just used the cookie here. By the way, if you are wondering how I did it, you press Ctrl+D, and then it creates this multiple signs, and you can write at multiple points at the same time. That's pretty cool. Okay, cookie.slice. And the slicing will start on the start index and will end on the end index. Oops, and index. Okay, cool. So now the first session ID should have the value, basically should have this value right here. That's good. Okay, so now let's test for a different session ID. What we need to do is, for this session ID to be different, we once again need to wait. And for us to wait, we need to make use of this function. Currently, we can't do it because this function is created in this describe block, which means it's only available here. And we need it to be available also to us. Therefore, I'll put it here in this main describe block, so that it's also available to us down here. So I could also put it up here, therefore it would be sort of in the global scope. It's not the best idea to do it. In general, in programming or in software engineering, you want to have things in as little of a scope as possible, meaning you want to constrain the scope as much as possible. That's just a good practice. Therefore, I put it here, and I will now use it. Once again, I will create basically the same way as we have it here. Where do we have it here? I will borrow this before hook. I will use it here. Once again, we wait for 1.5 seconds, and a friend session ID is assigned. Okay. So now what we need to do is here we need, in the expect part, we need to expect. And what we need to expect? We need to expect that the same thing that we had right here, and now .slice, it actually will also have the same index. Therefore, maybe we could also do a let start index and let end index, so that we have them available. And let's remove the consts here. Okay, let's currently slice it once again, starting at the start index, ending on the end index. And we expect this not to be equal. Oh, you change the equal, not to be equal to the first session ID. So here to not equal. Okay, that's quite a bit of logic. Let's see if this worked. So we wait and we wait again, and it is a pass for us. That's good. That's actually great that we managed to write this test. And now you can see basically that now the testing is of these two functions that otherwise, if you tried to test them separate, would be pretty hard. You would need to create a dummy object that has this cookie method that does something with these parameters. This would not be the easiest thing on earth, and currently it's pretty straightforward. I think we tested pretty good. Okay, that's it for the tests for application. Let's maybe now do a deployment to our server. Just to wrap this video up, before we do so, let's terminate it. Let's use our version control, added sessions. I'm publishing a new branch because I'm publishing code for episode 11. And I will move to the server and we'll make the deployment. Okay, so I'm on our server. I have already went into our to-dos app folder, and now we can do bash run.sh so that we get the newest changes. And then we'll need to do one thing. We will need to execute the newest DDL scripts. Let's do that now. Let's clear our screen and let's do it. So what I need to do is I need to check out the episode 11. You don't need to do it if you're just using the master branch. And then what I want to do is I want to make a quick inspection. If we have all the files here, we have our sessions.sql file. That's good. And so let's currently run our run script. Wait for it to finish. So it's finished. I will clear the screen and let's execute the command. So what we need to do is, let's say docker ps, let's grab the name of our container, let's say docker exec-it, name of our container, and then we set up the volume at /home/scripts, and we've called our file sessions.sql, right? Because here, if you go back here, you can see the volume that we have, and then the name of our file is sessions.sql. And by the way, here, quick change, we don't need it here in our Docker Compose file. You can just remove this. Okay, so I'll execute this. And we get a permission denied. That's because, of course, we need to say psql-u postgres and then -f and the name of our file. And now we can see table didn't exist, so it was not dropped, and then the table was created. That's fantastic. Okay, let's currently open our application. Let's see if everything here works. Okay, so we are in our application, as you can see in the web version. Let's go to inspect. Let's go to application, then to the cookies here. Let's refresh, and we can see the cookie here. So it looks like everything is working fine. That's good. That's very nice. Currently, we have the session implemented. So the session alone doesn't really give us a whole lot. However, in the next episode, we'll get to creating a mechanism for our users so that they can actually register, they can log in, and then they will be able only to see the to-dos that are actually created and managed by them. So today I thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.